Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Saara Vongue, and I'm a young designer who's currently studying UX UI design, as well as having experience within public libraries. And that's really pushed my passion in creating design for community good and for youth. But more importantly, I'll be the moderator for today. So welcome and nice to meet everyone. I would first like to start with an acknowledgement of country though. And in spirit of today's topic, you may see it looks a little different than the usual acknowledgement, but this is acknowledgement that I use with the kids. And if I could get the panelists involved just to get us moving a little, that would be really fun. And anyone who wants to join in behind the screen. But it goes a little something like this. So here is the land, so you can touch your desk or the floor if you're on the floor. Here is the sky up high. Here are my friends, and here am I. We thank the traditional owners for the land on which we play and learn, and we respect their elders past, present, and emerging. Hands up, hands down. We promise to take care for and look after this land. But thank you for that. And it'll be really nice to get everyone to acknowledge their traditional owners, the land on which they're zooming in from. That would be lovely and a great way to see where everyone's from. But we'll move on to the next bit, which is interesting. So when we'll go through in that panel planning phase, a piece of literature that kept coming up in my mind was The Little Prince. It's a classic, and it talks all about how children don't see the world the way we do. And in fact, that is exactly why the perspective matters. So here we have a little snippet from the book, and it's a little illustration of a child who's drawn a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant whole, which in itself is very frightening and imaginative, and it tells a story. But to the adult's eyes, it's mistaken as a simple hat, and it loses that richness that it has. And today's conversation is all about that. It's about how do we meet children where they are and listen deeply to what they have to say and what they experience, because at the end of the day, they have a unique value in how they see the world. Um, and but that's what we'll be going through. If you're also new to Portable and our webinars, we are an innovation partner for public good. So we host these webinars to share knowledge and provoke thinking about what it means to develop empowering services for the public and the people we serve, who serve it. Today, our focus is on how young minds shape good design and how to engage children and young people in service and product design, and why it is so important. Today, there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A panel, and Rachel, who's behind all the scenes, will be supporting that chat discussion. But onto the conversation. Today, we have a wonderful panel of very passionate and experienced professionals who have experience with designing with children. We first have Dr. Victoria Flanagan, Safeguarding and Participation Specialist at Uniting, who brings deep experience embedding children's rights into service delivery. Then we also have Associate Professor Michelle Tai from UNSW and the Black Dog Institute, who works intersex across youth suicide prevention, co-design and implementation science. And we also have Joanne Osborne-Taylor, who is a design services lead at Portable, who has rich experience designing with children in complex settings, including government, health, and education. But thank you everyone for joining, and it's going to be a really great conversation. But as we move on, as we link it back to that first illustration that we can remember of The Little Prince, it intrigues the question of why do we design with children and how has it influenced everyone's work here? Victoria, I would love for you to continue this on why do you design for children and how has it influenced your work?
Well, thanks, Sarah. Well, I've spent the last 4 years working at Uniting, which is a big service delivery organisation. I'm in the New South Wales branch. And I do quite a lot of my work with children and young people who've been in out-of-home care. So I think the question of, in terms of my work, why we design for children, there's probably like 3 main answers. And I think the first one is because, and the most significant one, is because the risk of not including children in service design is just too high. And the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse showed us what happens when we have organisational cultures that don't value children's voices and participation. And I think there are organisations like mine that are still dealing with that in a very real way every day through the National Redress Scheme. So we know that that risk is really too extreme. And to ensure that children are safe, we really need to actively include them in service design and make sure that we design and develop services that better respond to their needs. But I'd say the second reason why we include kids in design and design with them rather than for them is because they have a right to participate in decisions that affect them. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which again is like a fairly new convention, like, children's rights aren't a very traditional or historical concept. They're a relatively new and modern one. Yeah. But they have a right to participate, and they also have a right to access information that's relevant to them and to be heard when they express their opinions. And what we also learned from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse was that organisational cultures which actively promote and respect children's rights are the environments where children are most safe. So I think, and in addition to that, we also know that services that are designed with input from the people who receive them typically achieve much more successful and long-term outcomes. So there's that as well. And then I'd say just lastly, one of the things that characterises childhood is that you're learning how to be in the world and you're learning how to interact with others and you're learning how to be, a functioning member of society. And by inviting children to be part of a co-design project means that you're inviting them to participate in an activity where they have an opportunity to be really genuinely empowered, for adults to listen and take notice of what they say, and for them to learn about what genuine collaboration looked like. So hopefully, and I'm sure that Michelle and Joe would agree that all the co-design projects have been fabulous for one reason or another, even if they haven't worked out or aspects of them haven't worked out the way that you assumed they might. So I think designing with children is a win-win for everyone, for organisations, for children, for staff.
I'm just going to jump in because I love so much of what you just said there, Victoria, and just you've touched on so many important points. And I guess with my background, so I'm coming from a slightly different approach where I'm coming from an academic institution. So as I was introduced, I come from the Black Dog Institute, and we're very much a research translational institute. So I think we're not your typical kind of research institute where we are really thinking about who are we trying to help, what's our mission, and co-design is a really important part of how we get there. And increasingly, I guess just broader sort of in my field, we've seen a really big shift to making sure that ethically we are prioritizing the consultation and co-design with the people who will be the intended beneficiaries of what we're trying to do. So I think it's a really nice change, and I love seeing it reflected so heavily in our kind of funding bodies and our national kind of ethics statements. But and there's a really good reason why. So I think in my field around kind of youth suicide prevention and mental health of young people, we have seen so many trials in recent years fail because for a lot of reasons, but one big part is that the interventions themselves, they weren't co-designed. So they aren't really considering the needs and the ways that young people want to receive intervention and whether they even think they need these solutions. So there's an issue around, are we addressing unmet need at the first, sort of at the core? So one very large trial is called the Myriad trial. It was a massive trial, with a massive effort. It took so many years and so many people were involved, and it didn't work. And one of the things that really shone through is that nobody engaged with the intervention. And there's a few reasons why that happened. And it was a mindfulness-based intervention. One of them was just that the way it was delivered was that it replaced an activity and lesson. It replaced PDHPE, so sport. And so you're sort of giving something that people don't really want, and you're taking away something that they really do want. And then the sort of way that you really were going to benefit from the intervention was that there was an expectation that you would practice this skill outside of school. So there was lots of things that kind of went wrong. If they had gone to a really nice co-design process, I think they would have picked those things up really quickly. Young people they do have a lot of ideas and like opinions around things. So you need to get that information. So I think, yeah, so in my field, part of why we co-design and why I co-design is that it doesn't mean that your intervention is going to be successful, but you are certainly optimizing that kind of foundation for success. So that's a huge thing. And I just love hearing children and young people and just the things like what they like and what they want is so different. Like I'm just always astounded every time I go into co-design. Just what I think they might like is absolutely not what they want at all. So yeah.
Yeah. And I'll pick up on that point, Michelle, because kind of for me, the short answer of why we design with children and young people is because we're adults and because we see the world through an adult lens, which is kind of what you were talking about in terms of we've deprioritized something that maybe the adults think is less important. But I'll also kind of share a bit of a story as to why I think it's important. And I'll talk a little bit about this project throughout the conversation, but Portable are very privileged to be working with the Black Dog Institute and Michelle's team at the moment. And we are helping them to design a program for primary school students in New South Wales around emotion regulation. And part of that program is to create some animations that will help teach young people about emotion regulation. So we went into schools to talk to primary school students, and we wanted to understand what kind of characters resonate with them. And we wanted to understand what kind of scenarios these characters would be in where they might experience big feelings. So not just your average everyday, bit of stress, but a big kind of emotional reaction to something. Now, I went into that thinking, they're going to talk about a grandparent dying, or they're going to talk about being bullied at school, or, maybe they'll talk about a pet being sick. But actually what they talked about is my classmate stole my idea for my assignment, or I'm trying a new skill in the playground and I want to learn how to do the monkey bars and I can't do it and it's really hard and my friends know how to do it and I feel really embarrassed. So what I thought was a good scenario to put in those animations is not at all what children thought. And we would have put something in there incredibly serious, that probably would have freaked them out. So that's why we design with them, because we've forgotten what it's like to live through a child's eyes. And we need to design with them in order for them to remind us, actually, this is what should be included in the intervention.
That's really interesting because it really puts the perspective of the adult thinking and the child thinking. And even when I link it back to my experiences within the public library space, there's such an importance of it being a third space. And you see that in the way you can create a space that feels safe for them, but how it is used as a third home, third space, mind you, is how children are interacting with that space and with their peers, what connections they're making, how they talk to each other. And it's oftentimes through observation that you learn from what they bring rather than the assumptions that we make, which is really interesting. And there's a link between all your answers and why we all design for children in our own ways. But it has me following up on the question of, yes, this is why we design for children, but in terms of how do we create the right conditions for children to be designing with us? What does that look like? And Jo, if you would like to start off, since you had a few ideas as we were going into the discussion prior.
Thanks, Saara. It's an incredibly important question. I think when we were, discussing as a group what we wanted to talk about today, safety and trust was kind of one of the things that we said was most important. And so we have to think about how do we create a safe space for children and how do we develop trust so that they'll want to participate and fully bring themselves to any kind of co-design work that we might do. I guess from my experience, what I'll talk about is kind of a relational approach. So we have to acknowledge, if we're going into a classroom or we're engaging with a child or a young person around a service, that they probably don't know who we are. They don't have a relationship with us. So it's really important to know who does have that trusting relationship, and kind of throughout the process of design to engage with that person in preparation so that we understand, who the children are, what kind of behaviours we might expect, what's important to them, how they might engage in the session. And then to also have that person in the room with us, so that the young people feel safe and they have someone to go to if they need to. So that's really important, as well as understanding what kind of rituals they might already be used to, say in the classroom, for example, and to use, things that they already know and things that are familiar to them is really important. And the person, the adult in their life with that relationship can help with that. And also bringing that person in, from a safety perspective, we always create distress protocols. So we identify where distress could occur, how we might reduce that, of course. But then what is the process going to be if we see a shift in behaviour and distress might be happening during design, then bringing in that person who has the relationship with a young person to be able to support them in that moment. And really recognising the limitations of our own role in that process and really giving power over to those that have that relationship.
That's such an interesting answer, Jo. And I thought I could come from a slightly different perspective too, because coming from the out-of-home care space, where often the children out of home care have a primary relationship with their caseworker, there have sometimes been times where if a child wants to say something or a young person wants to say something critical about their caseworker, they often don't have many opportunities to do that. And so I've found as well, those kind of co-design opportunities present themselves in a really nice way for the child to have someone who's neutral, who's not the staff member that's working with them. But I agree with you, though, that safety needs to be part of those like initial scoping discussions. And actually, children are not all the same. They're all individuals. And I think that what's safe for one child or one group of children can actually change from group to group. And I think I was going to say too, in terms of creating safety, emotional regulation is definitely an issue. I was listening. Oh, that sounds like a great intervention that you guys have been designing. It'd be great for some of our kids and young people. But keeping an eye on kids or young people who might be getting emotionally dysregulated, which can happen really, really often with the kind of kids and young people that I'm working with. I love to work with colleagues and we work as a team, and we'll have someone who's responsible for that, as well as talking with the staff members and being agile and flexible, and how if you notice that something's not working for one child or group of kids, that you can then change the activity, give them a break, give them lots of options. I mean, I really like that phrase child-led, because that's how I like to do things. Yeah. And maybe Michelle has a different perspective as well.
Well, I just listening to both of you, I think that you're touching on a lot of critical sort of ways that we practically need to set up co-design for young children. And safety and trust is at the core of how you're going to get the most out of a child engaging with you or an adolescent. And I guess I was just reflecting on the kind of developmental kind of appropriateness of co-design, and that I think brings in a lot of complexity, because children and young people, I mean, that's a huge age range. I mean, that could be anywhere from sort of 5 up to 19. And developmentally, I know age isn't the only factor, but children's like how they're thinking changes over time, and age will very much influence how you're going to set up the conditions for them to engage in the process and for you to hear their voice. So obviously when you have a younger child, their kind of thinking is way more concrete, and you have to think of, you have to be really aware of that in terms of how you're designing the workshops or whatever your process for co-design is. And with older kids, you can have some concrete stuff still, but you can also, they're way more capable of abstract thinking, and you can do very different activities in that space. Age is one factor, but I think also things like neurodiversity or disability also come into play in that kind of developmental appropriateness kind of concept, because kids, for example, who are on the autism spectrum, they will need some more of that concrete thinking, and for you to approach things in a much, you need a certain amount of clarity if you're going to get to the solution that you're looking to get to. So I think that's always really important. And I think just from the safety perspective, I guess I just wanted to raise one thing, which was around what really kind of co-design should be doing. And sometimes when you're co-designing, in my world where we're co-designing with sometimes young people who have a lived experience of self-harm or suicidality, you need to set up your process with kind of expectations of what the purpose of co-design is. So it isn't a space for them to come and treat this as a therapy type session. And you can, where I've seen co-design go wrong, that's when that expectation that actually this should be like you bring your experiences in to get towards a solution, but it isn't necessarily a forum for you to just be there sharing your lived experience in a kind of therapeutic type of way. And so that can be distressing for that person, but for everyone else in the room too. So I think just making sure that you're working with your young people to kind of set up that kind of that foundation and that kind of expectation management. And then I think to Joe's point, when she was sort of talking about who should be involved, like I think from that perspective, you do really need to think about who needs to be in the room and whether you do need psychologists there. If we're talking about children, 12 or younger, do they need their parents there? I've worked with children and I've worked with adolescents. And I think when you particularly have younger people, I think it's really important that you have space, not necessarily for parents to be in the room, but for them to be around. So you also, you need to design for the, workshop or the kind of session, as well as space for trusted adults to be around if they become distressed. So yeah, there's lots of complexities with age and stage.
Yeah, I think, Michelle, you pick up on a really good point, and Danielle's actually asked a question in the chat about working with neurodivergent children and kind of any advice on that. I'm certainly not an expert, but the kinds of things that we've done in the past is making sure that we're giving instructions in multiple ways. So that's verbal instruction and then written instruction, very simple step by step. Break down the information so it's easy to understand, and any kind of superfluous information is not included in those instructions because it becomes really overwhelming and hard for any child really to understand. So that's really important. And as Michelle alluded to, giving multiple options for how you might complete a task. So that could be you can do it on your own or you can do it in a group, because some children will not want to work with others or will want the kind of safety and support of a peer. And then you might have different ways that the activity is actually completed. So there could be a drawing exercise, but the student, that isn't their preference to do a drawing exercise, or that doesn't really suit their way of expressing themselves. So they might be able to sit with one of the facilitators and just verbally tell them their story while they write it down. So the key is flexibility and always thinking about having multiple ways to do each of the kind of activities and instructions that you need to include.
And I was just going to add, I think another different thing about designing with kids and a way of promoting safety is about ensuring that the kids are consenting to what you're doing and asking for consent regularly. And there may be some kids who are fine to consent to one activity, but who actually don't want to do the next one or the follow-up, and just that check-in. And I think that is quite different to how you design with adults when you get consent at the beginning of the process and you assume that that's it and that adults understand they can leave at any point. I'm not sure that kids and young people always do. And especially if you're working in a school setting, because kids don't often have the option to, to opt out of an activity. So I think that's a really important part of creating that kind of safe environment too. And you end up getting quite good at it. And I think I've said before that I work with a young lived experience worker as well. And that point that you made, Michelle, about not having to share your story all the time and give personal details, you can still contribute your perspective really easily to projects without having to share intimate details about your personal life. And I've just got into an everyday practice of checking with him. Are you okay? Is it okay to continue? Is this going okay for you? Things like that, just to make sure that he's on board with what we're doing.
And with particularly young children, it's also knowing that the verbal consent isn't necessarily the only way that you might get an indication that someone is no longer wanting to participate. So paying attention to whether a child is actually participating in the activity that you've set, their kind of withdrawal or disengagement might indicate to you that they're not consenting. So knowing that children don't always express themselves through language, and paying a lot of attention to kind of behaviour is important for a number of reasons when we're designing with children.
Actually, Joe, just jumping on that, because I think one of the ways that I think that co-design with children versus kind of adolescents or young adults really is different is just, I think, the amount of people that you need in the room. So I think you really do need a lot more facilitators or like support facilitators. Like you'll have your facilitators, but also other people to go around and have that capacity to look at those signs and to engage with them. And I think to Victoria's point, to just check in if they still want to do these, making sure they know it's voluntary. So that's just our resourcing, I think, consideration in terms of if you really want to get the most out of your group, just it does require a lot of people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting because there's such a distinct difference when you're designing with children, and this, from my understanding, there has to be such an openness to alternatives or a holistic look on what you're doing in the methods to the smallest nuanced things that we've touched on. But Joe, earlier I remember we talked about that translation process, and we've touched on it a little bit, especially when you're designing with children. Can you share a bit about that in terms of, as well as everyone, on how that looks like? And
Yeah, we use a lot of play-based design activities. So that's really about meeting children or young people where they're at by thinking about, well, how do children and young people engage in the world? And particularly younger children engage through play. And so that's how we engage people in design. So part of the translation is I've created a research plan and I've got all of these kind of learning goals for the research in very organizational and adult language. And now I need to translate that into what are the kinds of activities and conversations that we want to be able to have with children and young people, and how do we interpret that into activities that are developmentally appropriate, which Victoria talked about, but also in a language that children would understand and in a way that they would actually want to be participating. So part of that translation is I want to learn what kind of characters in our animation children will resonate with. And so we create a card game. And we use a whole range of characters that are inspired by popular culture, but not popular culture, because we don't want that to be biased by what already exists in the world. But a card game, and we ask them to sort them into their favorite and their least favorite, and then tell us why they chose these things. And then we look for patterns amongst each of the children as to how they sorted them. So the translation there is in the activity that we design. But then there's another translation that happens after that, because we don't ask children direct questions in the way that we do with adults. If I said to a child, and it's not true of all children, so I don't want to sort of, say all children are the same, because they're not, and it depends on developmental stage. But if I were to say, why do you like a character? Like a lot of young children will be like, because it's red, because I like it, because my friend likes it. With adults, we'd be asking more why questions and wanting to get to kind of the deep meaning that sits beneath that. But that's not something that we do with children. So there's an interpretation that happens after we've done the design to say, okay, what did we observe? We observed children choosing these particular characters. A lot of them put characters down the end and describe them as scary. So our insight might be that children don't want characters that are aggressive looking or have particular expressions on their face. Now, the children didn't say to me, I don't want a character that has that expression on their face. That's the translation that we need to do as adults. And then really importantly, we need to go back and test that with children. So that's what we've done on the project Michelle and I are working on. We then created characters and we put them in front of the students and we said, okay, did we get this right? Have we heard you? What do you like about this? What don't you? And so, the translation has to happen at multiple points, and we need to check ourselves as adults that we're not putting meaning into something a child has done that is not actually real.
So good. I love, being reminded about what we went through. That's and all those great insights from the kids. And I guess I just wanted to touch on, I think, like your point around the kind of using different methods, so that kind of more play-based, interactive methods, and that worked really well. Obviously, we were working with primary school kids and with adolescents. I think that's still true, and it might just look slightly different in terms of I think you need to give them a diverse way of working with you, which can include digital whiteboards or like if it's in person, you might use like art-based methods or lots of different things. So I think it is less about kind of discussion and more about sort of activity, which I think is really, you get really rich kind of insights. But I think one of the big differences, or one of the, like when you're working with kids, I think you really do need to slow down. Like you need to take it slowly. That might mean that you have to be a lot more considered about what you really want to get out of that process, because you might not have a lot of time with them either. And that might just be because you can only get one chance with them, but also you'll have less kind of actual time in terms of the sessions, or they can only concentrate for so long as any of us can, but that becomes more prominent with younger kids. So if you only have 90 minutes, or you've only got 2 hours, like you might own on one or two things. And what are those one or two things going to be? And you need to factor in all of the invisible time. So it's like the rapport building, which is essential, and that just cannot be skipped when you're working with children and young people. It's part of them feeling safe but valued, and that like preparing that foundation that they recognize that you will listen to their ideas. So that you've got the rapport, you've got the activities, you've got the feedback, that loop that you need to give them within that session, so that they feel that you've heard them, which we all want. And then the kind of reward, I think like kids really are responsive to reward, and that can look like anything. And like Joe in our work, we've just given them like certificates and lollipops, and at the end, which they like love. Teachers might love that less, but it's just some recognition, and I think like reward for all. So it's rewarding like that they participated, that they gave up their time, that you recognize the effort that they went to, even if their ideas sit like across the spectrum of kind of what that looks like. So that kind of reward for all, and not just for like the people who had the loudest voice in the room, are all, I think really important factors.
I was just going to say something controversial and say that even though we've been talking about like the difference between designing with children and adults, there is part of me that thinks that good co-design with children and good co-design with adults is the same. That it's a philosophy about, I'm working with clients, it's a philosophy about the fact that clients have a right to be involved, that they have a right to participate, that we owe it to them to listen to them, and also that they have the capacity, that anyone has the capacity. Neurodivergent, people with disability, people, and I fundamentally believe that, and I think that really influences the way that I interact with kids. But at the same time, I also wanted to say, of course, there are differences, and I think that Joe and Michelle have articulated them so beautifully about slowing it down. Because I think I see my role when I'm doing co-design as like the facilitator of the design, and I want to be child-led and youth-led. And sometimes that means that I can have scoped a project, because I have an academic background and I'm used to having to do all those things for funding where you work out what the project's going to be like before you've done it. And then things can go in a totally different way if you really give that control over to kids. And I think I was telling you guys about an example. I just recently designed a welcome pack for all new children and young people at Uniting. And it was funny, I did some kind of co-design sessions with children and young people of like really broad different ages. And when I was with the really littlies, like the 2 to 6 year olds, although that's quite a big developmental difference. But the funny thing was I prepared a whole lot of activities and they really weren't working. And there were toddlers who just wanted to play. They wanted to lick my pens. I think like that. But then it became this really basic thing, watching that they weren't really engaging with what I was saying. It turned out to be a thing. Do the kids even know that they're at a Uniting service? Do they know the name Uniting? And that ended up being a really good way to do the session. Like who knows what Uniting is? Actually, none of them knew. Sorry, Uniting. But they all knew the name of their program and they all knew the name of their staff members. And I was like, that's great information. That's really good information to be able to take back. So I think and there are time limitations too, because kids have a limited attention span and often we have limited time with them, and you have to use that time wisely. Although things always take longer than you expect them to.
Absolutely. Because we've been focusing a lot on children, but there are a couple of questions coming through on the chat about teenagers and young people. and kind of how to engage them. And one of the things that I commonly come across, for us, we're working with clients and helping them with the design process. And there's a real kind of fear about doing that online. But with young people, online is their environment, it's the place they live. So using things like online whiteboards like Miro and getting them to draw as you would in an in-person engagement, they like totally resonate with that kind of way of kind of sharing and works really well. And we've run in some cases half day, full day workshops with young people, university students, and they really thrive in that environment. It can be also really interesting to see how peer relationships work across different ages. And something to be really mindful of when you're designing activities is how much is kind of what do I look like in front of my peers, which becomes more and more important in the kind of preteen and teen years. Is that giving you some kind of bias in your research? And where might you have kind of more individual activities or some kind of checking where you can reduce the impact of kind of peers, unless actually that's the insight that you're needing to generate is the relationship with peers. So just a couple of little, interesting differences there when you get into kind of older age groups.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it did make me think about the project that we've been working on together, but we did actually go into primary schools. And I guess that sort of I have 2 points. One is the context. So I think you're right, adolescents, you can do that kind of virtual workshopping and it really does work well. I've used that a lot in my own work as well. But I do think with kids, you are probably going to get more benefit if you actually work with them in person. So because the methods are different, I think they are more about drawing things or playing with actual sort of tangible things that you're not going to be able to do necessarily as easily or at all online. So so I think there is something to be said for, if it's possible with kids who are in primary school age, that you would try as much as possible work with them actually sort of in the person. So we actually did go into schools, and that meant that we had to engage with schools and find schools that were interested and supportive of this type of approach and to be welcomed into that setting, which is good. And when I think that really, that kind of social, almost social desirability sort of bias, you see that, that, I think that became really evident in that kind of in-person space where we could actually see kids holding back or looking sort of that kind of non-verbal body language, waiting for the kind of the alpha kids to speak up, and then they just sort of aligned their responses. And that did change how we ended up working with the kids a bit, because we had to make some kind of unfavorable decisions around what groups kids would go into. So we sort of gave them free choice about who they would go with. So they naturally want to go with their friends, but we just had to end up splitting them apart and assign them to groups, consciously to avoid particular relationships, so that where we knew a kid was going to be overly influential. So so that was a new learning for me. But it is something to be really mindful of if you want to hear from those kids who don't feel as confident to say, or they don't want to say something that's different to that. I'm just going to call them the alpha child.
Yeah, and I sometimes hearing those conversations, I even reflect back to a few years ago when I was in high school, and you can tell even in the classroom environment, how the tone will shift when you're put in different social settings. Even though it's with the same people, you see them every week, but you move to a different group, or it's just the way you socialize with the peers you are with, it changes everything completely. So it's really interesting to see how that fluidity and how we navigate this within design itself, whether that's a young person or a child, is so important.
And I think, sorry, I told you I was an interrupter, and I thought I was doing really well, but I've just done it. I was just going to say too that awareness of those power dynamics is also really relevant to working in trauma-informed ways. So and I know that can be hard if there are a group of children or young people that you don't have a relationship with. And that's, again, where staff can really come into their own in terms of helping you and guiding you. I've actually done a couple of projects where I've had maybe 5 or 6 young people, and I've asked them what would be your preference. And of course, with young people, they've all had different preferences. So we've tried to accommodate them. But I think and you're right, some would prefer to do things on their own and online. Yeah, but it's interesting how you can get like such different responses. And of course, sometimes I'll just throw that big one out there, that resourcing can be a big issue with co-design. And you often have to do what budgets will allow. Doing something online can be less expensive. And it can, I think it can work under the right conditions. But yeah, it is nice to be able to have the choice and to be able to give young people the choice.
Yeah, you've reminded me, Victoria, in a recent project, one of the designers in our team came to me and said, when you work with young people, you really need to leave your ego at the door because they will give it to you straight. And sometimes, we're working in, most people kind of in a professional sense will have a bit of a mask on, but children and young people don't. And so it can sometimes be a little bit confronting when they're just like, what were you thinking? I hate that. That's awful. Nobody is going to want to watch that. No one is going to want to use that. Here's what you should do. I love that about designing with young people, but it does mean keep your ego at the door. It's not about you as an adult. It's about, and in some ways, if that's what a child or young person is saying to you, then you've done a really good job of creating the space where they're able to be truthful and honest, which is ultimately what we want in that process.
I think it's time for us to get into the questions, I reckon. I can't believe it's 12:45 already. It doesn't feel like it. How the heck? So we'll answer a couple questions to the panelists today, and I'll just have a quick look in the chat. Is there any specific questions?
There's a good one here, Saara, about any advice around co-designing with 18 plus.
Co-design with 18 plus.
Yeah, I would say my first piece of advice was if you can get a young person actually to be part of the design team and facilitating those sessions with other young people, that can be, depending on the subject matter, of course, but that can be a good way to sort of, I guess, meet young people where they're at and not kind of be the old fogey in the room. Sometimes I feel like that, like I'm not cool enough to be with these kids who can speak their language. That can be useful. What do you find, Victoria?
Look, I was going to say, again, from that service delivery perspective, food is so important to the co-design sessions that I run. And I did a really, really food brings people together. And some of the young people who I work with who are actually 18 plus, who've transitioned out of foster care, but they're always hungry. So we start a session with food. But yeah, I did a great project. It sounds really boring, but for one of our supported accommodation services for young people aged 17 to 22, we did a co-design, like a collaborative review of the policies and procedures for that housing service. And we were really worried about how to do it. We had 3 staff and we thought that the young people would be really bored. They were so into it. We had to say, we need to stop now because we're worried about how much time we've spent on this. But we started the session with a lot of food. And when it came to we did 3 different days. And on the 3rd day, we asked them, what would you like to do? And they said, we'd like to cook lunch with you. So we brought the food and we all cooked together in the kitchen at the service and ate together. And it was just such a lovely, lovely experience that, yeah, I really remember that as a great project. And the kids asking us to do that, we really felt as if, this is like, had an impact, and yeah, they trust us, and they made they offered such good insights into the review of those policies and procedures. So yeah, I'm going to say food is up there as one of my number ones.
And if you get the food wrong, they'll tell you about it.
Either way.
Can I change the question?
Yes.
Sophie had one early on, which is around how we recruit children to participate in research. So I think there's a couple, I can speak to some of my experience. So obviously it depends on, so my work is it's kind of school-based interventions and then digital health interventions. So school-based stuff tends to be with that kind of younger children age group, and adolescents sit in the digital health space. So we are, obviously for the school-based stuff, it's through schools. That's the only way to really get to schools. And that project went a little bit different because we're designing prevention intervention. So it's actually for all children. So it's more than just lived experience. So we also needed to speak with just a generally kind of as representative as possible school age cohort. So we weren't, there was no entry criteria around lived experience because prevention is a bit unique in terms of the people who are going to be using it are generally the people who don't really need it yet. So it's almost a bigger challenge in the sense that it's much harder to engage them. So schools is one, but they can be difficult. So it's really about, I guess, like selling what you can bring to the school. Like, how will this project benefit the school? Like, why should they be involved? So it's really, a lot of it is sold in the kind of messaging to hook people in. With our older kids, obviously at the Black Book Institute, we have we have a reputation that people are attracted to. So, and we have social media and other forums to recruit from. So a lot of our studies, we will just recruit online, targeting, I guess, the adolescents themselves with messages that we might have developed with our youth advisory group. And sometimes I think we've noticed that sometimes a lot of the way that adolescents come into our studies is actually through a friend or a parent seeing the ad. So sometimes actually like we're evolving our recruitment so that actually like who we're targeting in the initial advertisement is actually one of those groups instead, recognizing that they're probably going to be the person who will say to the young person who might need to come into our service that actually I saw this and I think would be really good for you. So we use a mix of, different strategies, but it's always, I think fundamentally boils down to being really clear about the benefit for the person that you're trying to bring into the study.
Yeah. Did anyone else want to share any advice on that question?
I think part of it is also thinking about where it wouldn't be appropriate for someone to participate because it might be harmful for them. And so that can be, in the case of schools, working with teachers or wellbeing staff, depending on the subject matter that you're entering into in your workshops. So you might have a discussion with them about whether it would be a good idea for someone to participate. And we always take that decision really seriously because we don't want to remove that opportunity for young people. But in some contexts, the subject matter might actually be more triggering and more harmful for the person. So I think that's really important. Victoria, I'm interested to hear how you navigate that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And of course, Joe and I met because we were doing a project together on children who were in out-of-home care. And there were a lot of discussions about which children would be most appropriate to participate. And I think it's a balance. I think it's a balance of wanting to give kids the opportunity and to allow children and young people who are interested and who would like to participate to give them that chance. But at the same time, having those discussions with staff members and people who know those children and young people well, who can give you a heads up about what's happening in that child's life and whether it would be an appropriate time. I did a project a little while ago on the impact of domestic and family violence on children and young people in our services. And that was a great project to work on because, of course, the staff told me straight away, if you tell the kids that you're doing a project on domestic and family violence, they will not want to participate. And I think she was right. So what we did was we talked about service delivery and tell us about caseworkers and staff who've had a really positive impact on you. And that was the way in. And we got lots of information about DFE, but that was about, the language and about how to frame. And that was, a lot of input from people who knew that particular cohort of children and young people well. So, I think that's a discussion all the time that we're having when we do any co-design in our services. And we provide a lot of services. And each cohort of kids and young people is different. So those discussions need to take place, pretty regularly before a project.
Yeah, and it's really about taking that trauma-informed approach across all projects. And that's thinking about how are you giving young people choice in whether they participate, how they participate, what flexibility that you provide in that process and that experience, reciprocity. So how do you value their time, whether that's some sort of reward or for older children, paying them for their time in the way that is appropriate. So that trauma-informed design should, we can put that lens really over all projects with children because by their very nature, they are vulnerable. but we shouldn't see that vulnerability through a deficit lens. We should see that as the ability to create a safe space, not the ability to wrap children in cotton wool because they're too young and they can't actually engage. It's about us meeting them where they're at and making the process one in which they can engage, because we're changing the way we approach it rather than expecting children to kind of, I guess, enter into a process that's more adult-like.
And I was just going to quickly add, sorry, I know we're almost out of time. I was going to quickly add too, I think that question of payment is a really important one. And we've just had a lot of discussions recently about like a payment policy for people with lived experience, including children and adults. And I think that's really, really important, that we don't just expect children and young people to participate just for the good of it because they want to. But I was going to say too, I remember a really, really meaningful moment for me was when I was doing a project and we were paying the young people to participate. And it was a young lady who decided to do an interview on the phone with me, didn't want to come to the office. And I'd had a really good chat with her and she'd given me such great insights. And I said, we're going to make sure that we pay you and your program manager will take care of that. And she said to me, I would have done it even if you didn't pay me. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of response. I really want kids to get something out of co-design, but I also feel really strongly that when they're contributing to the creation of effective, successful services, that we need to reward them for their insights that they've provided.
Yes, and there is actually a national paid participation policy to like guide that, and part of that is for safety and making sure they are recognised for the time they're giving up.
And Renee just asked a question about like what's the appropriate form of payment, and I think it's that the answer is it depends, right? So what is the context of the child? How old are they? What's the kind of their environment? What you have to have that discussion with the people in the project, your client, the people closest to those children, and determine what is most appropriate. There are too many factors, I think, to be able to say it's one or the other, and thinking creatively as well. I think one of the things I would just say to avoid is don't give people vouchers for shops they're never going to visit or is not close to where they live. So if you do go down a voucher rate, maybe ask the children, what kind of voucher would you like? Or give a voucher that can be used in lots of different places as well.
I have a slightly different perspective because I'm from a research, and obviously we are very much governed by ethics, our ethics approval. So there are actually more specific ways of forms of reimbursement and sort of boundaries around that. So if we're engaging with our youth advisory group, we will pay them at the national rate by direct transfer. If they're in a research study, we might, and when they're not sort of part of a youth advisory group, we would normally pay them at the national rate, but through vouchers, so e-gift cards, but also just being selective and not having any alcohol shop available. So you do need to sort of like trawl through and see like what would, like you can choose to get rid of some options, and you need to be mindful about your age group. And then with the school staff, if you're going into a school and you're working with kids in a school ethics will not let you pay them. So that's a different thing. So that's when I think that kind of like food, or it might be fidget toys or something like kids are going to like. Yes. So you still, I think it's really important that you're recognizing that reimbursement aspect, but it's going to look different. And to me, that's ultimately governed by what ethics said.
It's really nice to even close it off on the note that even like the simple act of reimbursing a young person or child gives them value to what they give you, and because you are designing with them and it is co-design, so why not value their time and their opinions if they are being involved, and they should be involved. We are coming to the end of it. I wish it could go longer. This could go for hours if we could. But it's been really nice for everyone to join in on the conversation. It's been a really beautiful discussion. And what I've pulled out of this entire conversation that we have had is there's a sense of humility that you need to have at the core of everything. And that's really beautiful to see. And I would love to see that. It's really inspiring actually to see that in the professional world and how that's being implemented. And I hope everyone can take a small bit out of it, inspiration and the information that we have. But thank you so much for that. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week. We have connections here if you ever want to reach out to anyone here on the panelists. And we also have a list of resources that the panelists, Joanne, Michelle, and Victoria, and myself have recommended if you want to learn more about what it means to design with children. We will also be sharing those through an email inbox as well as the recording. But thank you everyone for interacting and all the many questions. It's been a lot. It's a really great way to see the engagement. But thank you so much.
And well done to you, Saara, for
And
stepping in to being the moderator. What a great job you did. Congratulations.
if you look at my hands underneath the table, it's a whole nother. It's shaking completely. But
You did great.
thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.